Hello, I'm Deah and Merryana, aka Deah. I'm an Indonesian Pakistani non-binary lesbian.
Hello, I'm Mariana Salem, aka Mary. I'm a Lebanese Aboriginal bisexual woman.
We are two writers who love movies, television, and books, especially when they're gay,
And welcome to GayV Club, where we'll be analysing LGBT texts.
that we like, that we don't like, and how we relate to these texts as gay people of color.
Woo!
We are now at the end of volume 2, or the beginning of the end. We're at the beginning of the end of volume 2,
Also, possibly at the end of the world.
which is fun. That's very fun. This is the first episode of GayV Club of its kind because we're actually not recording it in the same room as each other.
Nope.
So we're trying that out.
We're usually used to, self-isolating with each other, but that's no longer an option, which is just very uncool of Miss Rona, I feel.
Yeah, this is actually the longest time in the past 6 months that I've not seen you in real life. It's actually kind of sad. I miss you.
I miss you too. It's just not the same. We've been reading Pride and Prejudice to each other on the phone, and it's just not the same because I don't get to witness your face like when I read certain scenes.
Ditto.
I also would like to put it, I just generally miss hugging people and sanity of the masses.
Yeah, I missed that. It was entertaining to just like bump elbows with people, but then it got really sad. So
Yeah. But speaking of sadness, this is a segue trademark.
certainly a segue that was made.
Today, we are going to be talking about the representation of queer sadness in cinema and a little bit in TV, and how that's evolved over time and how perceptions of it have evolved over time.
Yeah, we wanted to maybe discuss several bad tropes in TV and where they come from and why they're still persisting, and I guess discuss some examples of that and maybe have a bit of a discussion about why we specifically like so much bad shit or why there's so much bad shit in the existing LGBT media canon, I guess.
Obviously, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about are in a very Western context, and a lot of stuff will be in the American context because that's where the majority of media that we consume is from.
This episode is probably going to touch on a lot of things that we've already spoken about in previous episodes, but I guess just with a greater focus.
We'll also talk about how a lot of the time when queer sadness is represented, the source of queer sadness is usually from the straights, if you know what I mean. Like it's caused by the straights, which most of the time it is. But I'd like to talk about like certain instances where people have made media where queer sadness does not only come from the straights or the cisgendereds and what that looks like.
Okay, yeah, so where do you want to start?
I think we should start at the beginning with the Hays Code and with Hollywood films in the 30s.
The Hays Code, as we mentioned previously in our episode on bisexual representation, it was a set of strict rules and regulations on the way basically everything was represented in Hollywood films. There were a lot of things to do with representations of race, of gender, and
Religion, everything. It was literally about everything. The idea was that all this stuff would be regulated.
what we wanted to look at is especially how they regulated quote unquote deviancy and deviant acts and deviant people, i.e., LGBT people, and how we were represented.
So, the Hays Code and how it affected the LGBT community specifically, and obviously also specifically in the United States, is explored thoroughly in this documentary that I highly recommend people go and watch, called The Celluloid Closet. It was made in, I think it was made in the 90s. But a lot of what they explore in that documentary is still very relevant now. And the Hays Code, when it came about, basically said you could kind of have gay people in your movie, but they had to be represented in a way that was undesirable. Like you couldn't have them being happy. You had to represent them in a way that framed them as the deviants that they were. That's the bad irony of it. Like it's not like you couldn't have gay people in your movie, but if you did, they had to be delirious or unhappy or disgusting or perverted. And even though the Hays Code is no longer really practiced officially, the legacy of that is still very prominent because that was just how it was done for so long. A lot of particularly older filmmakers still and older studios still sort of adhere, I don't want to say unconsciously because I don't think they're doing it unconsciously, but they still adhere to some version of this that has been diluted over the years.
Even when queerness was subtextual, we would be suffering in the subtext. I'd
Yes.
say, to the point where even sometimes today, it feels like the only way we can see ourselves is through sadness, relating to a sad character or looking at a sad character and trying to see if like you can connect that with your own queer experience, especially because it's so subtextual. Any kind of vague sadness in a lot of those old movies is something that I latch onto.
I agree with this in the sense that you see it a lot online. You see a lot of gays be like, oh, the reason this character is sad, I've decided. I have diagnosed them with being gay. And it's like, it's very interesting to see that a lot of the time, like I see weird battles online between people who want to headcanon a character as mentally ill when they may not be explicitly mentally ill, and the battle between them and the people who are like, no, they're not mentally ill, they're just gay. I remember seeing this a lot in, I hate how I'm sorry to bring this up, but I do remember seeing this in the Sherlock fandom quite a lot,
I do recall this.
particularly with John Watson. A lot of people would be like, oh, John doesn't have PTSD, he's just gay. And I'd be like, hmm. And the worst part was that people would still do that when he was quote unquote unhappily married to a woman. People would be like, the reason he's unhappy is because he's gay. And I'd be like, no, the reason he's unhappy is because he's a dick. Just adding to that, like in the sense, like there's always a weird battleground in this way, like from a fandom point of view, between fans who want their characters to be clinically sad in some way and those who want them to be gay. There's like the two men clasping arms of people who want them to be both.
Listen, just being gay is a mental illness. Like, I'll just say that.
It is in fandom, the way some of these bitches behave.
No, honestly, that's what's so messed up about the Hays Code. Like we talked in the bisexual rep episode about how like same-sex attraction or non-cis gender representation was used to imply craziness in a way to imply deviancy. It's the fact that it's been so damaging to the point where we will watch something and associate being gay with having a mental illness with being gay. Obviously, it is worth something that so many people in our community do have mental illnesses for several reasons. You know, we are quite vulnerable to mental illness in our community, but like it's just so crazy that even like as consuming media, consuming fiction and making that correlation anyway almost automatically. I'm thinking of Hamlet right now because
Of course you are. When are you not?
when am I not? Like there are so many people being like, oh no, Hamlet's mentally ill, which is why he treats Ophelia this way. Or no, Hamlet's gay because he treats Ophelia this way. It's like, poke no los dos.
Literally.
Like, these regulations, they were so damaging and they birthed so many tropes like bury the gays, where, you know, maybe if a queer character wasn't necessarily evil or villainous, like they would still be suffering due to, I don't know, getting the fucking scarlet fever or being killed, or it would be weird because there are some of the films where you see characters being hate crimed but you aren't specifically given a reason.
What do you mean?
Somehow you still know it's a hate crime. I'm thinking right now, even though this isn't necessarily Hays Code, I'm thinking especially of Rebel Without a Cause.
He had several causes.
And he did have several causes. James Dean Bicon. Of course, we also had the depraved queer, which often came in the form of having crazy villains or...
Can I just say the worst thing I saw of that and recognized later as an adult. I grew up watching the Ace Ventura movies because like my sisters loved them and my brother loves them too. And we grew up, and like I think it's in the first film, the big reveal when Ace figures out why the villain is doing all this is because essentially like it's the villain is a woman, and you find out that, oh, actually, she's secretly a man. And literally that's how the scene plays. They actually, a bunch of cops come in, strip her down, and it's just really bad. Like, it's horrible. I should have put a precursor on that. But the Ace Ventura film, the first film, is like extremely transphobic, but it is never framed as something that is wrong. It's just framed as like, well, they're crazy. They want to kill all these animals because they're crazy. And the reason that they're crazy is because they're secretly trans. Ugh, it's bad. It's bad, kids.
I'm also thinking about Psycho in this way.
Yeah, another one where it's Norman's unhingedness, because there's never a specific diagnosis. It's connected to him being like a person who cross-dresses. Ugh. And there's actually like a funny, not a funny, it's not funny, but that's the only objection that they had when Alfred Hitchcock submitted the script was the use of the word transvestite. They tried to get him to not use that word.
I'm actually remembering another objection that they had to that film, and it was very controversial at the time that they showed a toilet being flushed.
Oh
like,
no, the illusion is shattered.
Seeing the final cut of the film, seeing like all these horrible things in this film, and they're like, I can excuse all that, but I draw the line at seeing a toilet being flushed. Yeah, that's just something that I specifically recall from my early days as when I was trying to be like a film buff. And like I'm like, oh yeah, I know cinema. I've seen one Alfred Hitchcock film. Speaking of Alfred Hitchcock, he also adapted Rebecca. It's a film based on a novel by Daphne du Maurier. It's very much the evil lesbian trope. I don't know. A lot of the Wallowa still like Rebecca. That's another thing that we kind of wanted to talk about, is that even though we see all these horrible representations of ourselves, even though we see these representations of ourselves which are supposed to be undesirable, like it has morphed our taste to a point where we want to see villains, or like we love the villains because we can see ourselves in them.
Yeah, as I've spoken repeatedly about on this podcast, I very heavily related to Scar in Lion King growing up, just because I thought he was fabulous. And my one true desire in this world, still to this day, is as a gender-bent version of Scar. And purely because I want to sing Be Prepared, because it's such a bop. And I think the interesting thing with villains as well is that even villains who are not sad or queer-coded in any way, people love to still headcanon villains as queer in some way because of how long that went on, how long villains were queer-coded. And of course, like, I'm thinly veiled trying to get around to that iconic tweet where someone was like, Kylo Ren is queer-coded.
I hate how much we've actually mentioned Kylo Ren throughout the course of this podcast.
Because I freaking hate him. There's just too much appreciation for this character in public discourse, and I want to nip that in the bud. But I remember distinctly in The Last Jedi especially, a lot of Reylos were like, oh, not Reylos actually, but just Kylo stans were like, oh, he's actually bi or actually gay, and you know this because he's sad and because he didn't get along with his parents. What? No, he didn't get along with his parents because he a fascist.
Given the way that Star Wars turned out, I wouldn't even have been mad. Like, that would have just been Disney being Disney if Kylo had been gay.
True. But Disney, I guess the reason we keep sort of bringing them up is because they are like the kings of this villainize the gays trope. They do it all the time, or they did it all the time, and they're still doing it. They are still out here making Beauty and the Beast, casting a gay man as Gaston, and then making their quote-unquote first gay character, LeFou, who's in love with Gaston. I'm still mad about that.
Because of the code, out of that was born so many of these tropes in TV and film. I think it's interesting to note, in literature, prior to the invention of cinema, these tropes, they did kind of exist, but more with a slightly different twist to them, specifically of stuff like Jekyll and Hyde. That story, it was kind of born out of the paranoia that young men in the late 1800s suddenly have to face after the amendment to the Burglary Act and criminalization of homosexuality. Stories like Jekyll and Hyde were born out of that fear of being one of them, of, I guess, being punished for being like that, or for being mistaken as like that even. I think we can't discount literature.
No.
You can't explain away the literature.
And there have been plenty of interesting queer analyses of Frankenstein in that vein as well. I just hate Frankenstein. Jekyll and Hyde should have been what Frankenstein is to the world in a way. Everyone thinks Dr. Frankenstein is such a like badass. Like all he does is sleep in that story. Like he's the most boring bitch alive. He sleeps, he wants to shag his cousin, he doesn't want to shag his cousin, he causes trouble, he creates life, he sleeps. Like that's the whole story. But like for some reason, I just think Dr. Jekyll is a much more interesting and scary figure and has a lot more to tell us about the dangers of experimenting on yourself and outside the boundaries of known science than Frankenstein could ever had. Like, because really, like, let's think about this. Who didn't know that creating a life and then abandoning it would be a bad idea? Like, who didn't know that?
I don't know. I mean, thank you, Mary Shelley, for inventing science fiction.
Yeah.
Thank you. I owe you my life.
We do. But I'm not, and this is not a dig on her. She wrote a good story. I just mean that, like, the way that story is perceived as the best cautionary tale. I'm like, I was never going to do this. No one in their right mind was ever going to do this.
Thing is, I've never been able to like enjoy Frankenstein because I've only ever interacted it in the context of like studying it in high school and in university. So I've only ever read Frankenstein like for educational purposes. Like I've never read it like for the sake of my own enjoyment. I don't know how much I can really contribute to my thoughts on Frankenstein in that regard because that you just get a special resentment for a text when you have to study it. Like maybe when you're forced to read it.
Maybe that's where my resentment comes from. But I also do think that Dr. Frankenstein is an idiot. And maybe he's an idiot because he's gay. Who knows?
Because you know how there are two main versions of Frankenstein, like the first one that was published and then a revised version released a few years later. I'd say the second version of it is a lot gayer in Walton. Like Walton is so gay in that.
Yeah.
And also the thing about Victor wanting to marry his cousin, she's not his cousin anymore in that version.
Oh, thank God.
So I think Shelley knew. The way that a lot of people have interacted with that text is thereby by that, second censored version. I feel like Victor's actions in the second version are kind of made to look out of his control, whereas in the first version, they were very deliberately evil, horrible. Yeah. This is a really random aside. I was hoping to actually interject and talk a bit about Carmilla.
I would like to also briefly talk about Dorian Gray.
Oh.
I have a lot to say.
Yeah, I mean, Oscar Wilde, as deeply problematic as he is, was the most notable victim of the Labouchere Amendment.
Which caused that paranoia, which Jekyll and Hyde was born from. So, it's worth talking about.
Dorian Gray is literally the biggest twink in literature. He is a disaster twink. I feel sorry for him because I feel like if he had some DILFs in his life, he may not have gone down the path that he went down. Because if he looked around and went, oh, I don't want to get ugly like all these men around me. Apparently there were no DILFs in London in 1803 or whenever the frig this was set. But Dorian Gray, Basil is so in love with Dorian. Like when you read it, it's almost like it makes me mad. I'm like, dude, just like, fellas, is it gay to paint a portrait of your friend and then like obsess over that portrait for years?
I think possibly.
To conclude my Dorian point, I think given what we know about Oscar Wilde and what happened to him and what was happening to other men at the time, and the fact that Dorian's close relationships are primarily, like, they're all with men, also specifically with men who aren't shown really to be in relationships with women. Like, Dorian does court a woman throughout the, first part of the book. But of course, Dorian does become a depraved murderer. But it's quite funny because he's sort of ew. Every time he does it, he's like, this is disgusting. The point we're trying to make is that in literature, this was happening before film. So it's unfair to say that these tropes only came about because of the Hays Code when they did exist prior to that. And you have something to say about Camilla.
Yeah, I mean, Carmilla, the very first vampire novel, published vampire story in Europe, is Carmilla is a lesbian.
So much early vampire fiction from Europe does incorporate lesbianism. There is Carmilla, and another one I can think of right now is the poem Christabel. And these stories do incorporate lesbianism, and you know how like vampires in at least Christian mythos, like they're designed to be everything that the church was afraid of, and being a lesbian and being predatory to vulnerable young women was one of those things, and you see that in this.
So it's not just the demonization of gay men, it's also the demonization of gay women. Even though historically gay men have been persecuted more than gay women, unfortunately, it's bad all around. It is something that definitely existed.
It is, and I don't think we should engage in like oppression Olympics, because I don't think that's ever really been helpful. But I think the oppression of gay men and the oppression of gay women and then the oppression of non-gender conforming people is all very nuanced, but it's all very different. But like it also all comes down to the same causes and the same group of people that are perpetuating it.
So let's move on to our next point, which is, why do we love so much bad shit? Why do we as a community love so many terrible, or make so many terrible texts for ourselves?
Why, it's almost like a form of collective self-harm. It's very strange. But I feel like as well, many people in the community only look to the mainstream. And the mainstream has never historically been good at providing us with anything other than images and encouragement of our own suffering. So I think, like, why do we love so much bad shit? Is because many people believe that's the only thing that is out there, and also maybe on some level even believe that you deserve it because all these movies are telling you that you do.
Texts like these definitely contribute to internalized homophobia in that sense. Also, there's the issue of the fact that the mainstream is more accessible, so we look at the mainstream. There aren't a lot of openly LGBT creators in the mainstream. I mean, there are, but also, like, it's still quite a lot of an issue. Non-LGBT people that have profited off, I guess, reinforcing homophobia in a lot of their works, especially in horror. And like, it's very weird to see people within the community latch on to their works, which are mainstream, because it's easily accessible in the mainstream. The most recent example I'd say of this would be with the It movies, based on the Stephen King book, and the way that so many people there's like this cult following of like people obsessed with those gay kids that died in that movie, in that book, and like wanting to ship them together or wanting to rewrite a happy ending. But like, I see a lot of people kind of justifying their obsession with it with a way to, I guess, for them to process their own pain, because they see the suffering is something that they relate to. But also, I don't think that's healthy. And especially with a text like that, like, there's no responsibility from the creators of that text with the kind of messages that they're putting out there. So as much as you interpret and change a text in your mind, I don't think it is healthy to be latching onto something like this.
Like, I should note that this is a story which can be regarded as sympathetic to victims of homophobia, because the villain is literally a homophobic clown. You know, the hate crime scene is based off a tragic incident that happened in Stephen King's hometown that apparently inspired the story. But something to consider besides it, the novel, is the rest of Stephen King's work. Like, this is a man who has written, I think, some of the most horrible demonizations of queer people in some of the stories, but has also strangely written quite a few queer characters that some people do find good representations. So his work is a real mixed bag, and there's so much bad amongst the good that I think he simply doesn't really care, just write something for everyone so that he can get something from everyone. Even though the novel It is a story that's sympathetic to gay people, I don't think there's any value in engaging with the text in this way. I don't think people should be wasting time like trying to find any meaningful representations in it or any kind of solace in a story like this. Like, it's just masochistic.
I was originally like quite, not a bit, I don't want to say fan, but I really appreciated the first of the new It films, because the director actually seemed to remove a lot of the homophobic, I don't even want to call it subtext because it's blatantly clear in the book that the clown deliberately targets queer kids, and the reason that the police never do anything about it is because they don't care about the queer people that are being targeted. And that is completely not present in the first of the new films, which I really liked. I also obviously liked that they took out the really disgusting orgy scene and the and the implication that in order to defeat the clown, they had to become adults. And in order to become adults, they all had to have sex with each other. I really liked the way that the first film was adapted because it seemed to remove a lot of the harmful elements of the text, of the original text, in favor of making something that was more generally scary, which I think worked. And I was kind of shocked and horrified when in the second film they sort of brought it all back for seemingly no reason that had any value other than wanting to virtue signal, be like, oh, we're hip, we're aware that the gays suffer. And the second film, I was really sure. I like to stay away from like spoilers of things in general, so I didn't know Xavier Dolan was in this movie. I didn't know that the movie opened up with him being hate crimed, and I was shocked when they revealed that Richie was actually gay, like Bill Hader is gay, because there was none of that. There was no subtext to that in the first film, and there was nothing about that in the book. And what frustrated me most when I looked up this stuff about what the director had said about these decisions was that he wanted to adapt it for a more modern audience, and so it decided to include it. And I just thought that he was so unaware of what he was doing. He was so unaware of the history of hate crimes being portrayed in film and the bury the gays trope and the unhinged queer person trope. Like, he's so unaware of these things that he had included them in his film, like thinking they were progress. And I think it just spoke to a real need for if you are a director or a filmmaker who is not gay or not of a particular group of people, not of a particular marginalized group, and you want to include something in your film that has to do with a marginalized group, you should speak to people of that group. In the very least, be like, hey, I'm thinking of doing this in my film. Is that appropriate? Because I can guarantee you if he had spoken to any queer filmmakers during the time when he was developing that script, all of them would have said no, except for Xavier Dolan, who apparently was really desperate for that check. I just feel like it was a very misinformed attempt at exploring homophobia and portraying it as a problem, because really the real problem should be the friggin' psychopathic clown. It shouldn't have to be like homophobia. I don't need to know that. I don't go to a movie to discover that homophobia is a problem. I go to a movie 9 times out of 10 because I want to experience something new. But yeah, that's my 2 cents. I just think the director of It Part 2, I think he was just wildly irresponsible and ignorant, no matter what his intentions were.
I think also the casting of Xavier Dolan has a lot to do with it. Like, I know Xavier Dolan is like the king of being hate crimed on camera. Half his filmography consists of he himself playing a character being hate crimed, and I don't know, I respect that, because I actually think very weird the disparity between his own work and the other films that he acts in. And I think it speaks to a larger issue of the way that non-queer filmmakers, now that there's been slightly more conversations about representation on camera and like who gets to tell certain stories in front of the camera, like whether you should cast actually gay people as gay characters. And I feel like a lot of straight cisgendered filmmakers or creators, they will tell quote-unquote LGBT stories, not really with much input in the creative process from them, but they will cast openly LGBT actors to play in these roles. And it's kind of like they use them as a shield from any kind of criticism. Xavier Dolan reminded me of this because he's also in Boy Erased, and I feel like Joel Edgerton also did that. Like, that's a terrible film, which I think is really poor representation of homophobia and the way that we deal with homophobia and the way that we've suffered homophobia as well. And it's just very irresponsible. And I know Joel Edgerton, like himself, definitely has said that he didn't make that movie for gay people. He made it for the parents of gay people, for the parents who had to cope with having a gay child. He definitely used the involvement of openly gay or bi actors in his film like as a shield from criticism in that way. So I definitely see that with it.
Yeah,
for example.
for real. In that sense, it can be very predatory because a lot of openly gay actors don't get a lot of work in mainstream cinema. So when they're approached by these directors who are straight and cisgendered and they're making a film and they want like openly gay actors in it, I bet a lot of them feel like a certain pressure to be like, yeah, like even though they know it's wrong or they know because they may not get work otherwise.
Another example that I can think of is the recent, like, extremely transphobic, lesbophobic film and novel Adam that came out, and the treatment of the extras on that film who I've spoken out online. A lot of they did get actually trans extras to work, and a lot of them like were
Oh
actors
my
that weren't
God.
part of a union. So they were like poorly treated on the set of that film and like constantly misgendered. The film itself is obviously just an insult to everything. Like, I actually can't believe this story even exists. It's just a horribly lesbophobic, transphobic story written by someone who is apparently a lesbian. I don't understand how a lesbian could even write something like that. And also, like, the movie itself is even directed by a trans man, but I can't quite understand how he would make something like that either. It's just a very confusing text to exist. I guess it just comes down to responsibility and taking responsibility for what you are going to show in a film. I watched a really great Bolivian film recently called Tu me manques, based on a play. It's very meta and it kind of combines the medium of film and theater. It's very much about this specific subject matter, like of choosing to tell your own story, even though it's sad, of being a LGBT person and wanting to tell your story and like the responsibilities that you must carry with that. And there's a great line from that movie, which I love, which is, once you decide to tell a story, it's no longer your
Ooh.
own. So that's why you need to take a lot of responsibility. I think another great thing about this story is basically it's about a guy who is a playwright who has written a play about his ex-boyfriend who has just committed suicide due to his homophobic family. The movie is like a meta story of him trying to write the play and trying to get it produced in a country, Bolivia, where these conversations weren't being had at the time. When the play itself came out, like, it actually was quite revolutionary and did lead to a lot of national conversation. So he wants to tell this story about his ex-boyfriend who has just committed suicide, because when you tell a story, it's no longer your own. And because this is a story that will definitely resonate with the rest of the community, he actually casts 30 different people to play his boyfriend, like the name Gabriel. So he casts 30 different gay men to play Gabriel. There are even like some trans men as part of the cast, as a way to show like how universal this story can be and how this story could relate to so many different people. And yeah, it's just a great film. I really recommend it. It definitely delves into like that responsibility that you have and that you should uphold when you are trying to tell a story about sadness and about like other sensitive topics and like issues that plague our community. You need to consider everyone, because even though, you know, I'm a very big believer in art being therapeutic and making art for yourself and trying to say what you want to say and that's it, but also like you do need to consider, if you choose to release art that way, you do need to
Yeah,
consider
I
how it's
think
going to affect.
I said way back in the LGBT biopics episode, and that is filmmaking is an act of community. Like, it takes a community to make a film, it takes a community to enjoy a film. So while I understand like it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of a film, oh, this is just my thing, it just is about me, it just affects me. It doesn't. It never has. Like, if you are a queer person making a film about how sad you are not sad in a vacuum. You are not sad alone. People need to understand filmmaking as an act of building community, as an act of adding to community, as an act of giving to community. But it's clear we're not thinking of film, particularly straight filmmakers don't think of making LGBT films or making LGBT characters or LGBT elements of their work. They do not think of it as a communal act. They think of it as just sort of borrowing an interesting trope or borrowing an interesting plot line. But like, we're not plot lines. We're a community of people and are marginalized and are happy and sad and all lots of other things. And it is your ethical duty, whether or not you are a queer filmmaker or not a queer filmmaker, regardless of who you are, it's your duty, if you are making a film about a certain community, it is your ethical responsibility to consult that community and share work with that community.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I do think a lot of the LGBT like openly LGBT filmmakers that we discussed in our Gay Gays episode, they do that. Like, it's not even something that's particularly difficult. It's not even something that's very apparent. But like, you know, when you think about it, like, this does exist in the work of Xavier Dolan, of Desiree Akhavan, of so many of these filmmakers. Like, they tell very personal stories, but even though these stories are specific to them, the reason that they're so well loved by the community is because we can definitely relate to them on several different levels. levels and like different people relating to different levels of their work and to different nuances. And I think they are careful to take that into account, which is why they're such great filmmakers and great storytellers.
Agreed. And I think one of the reasons why people like Xavier Dolan and Desiree is that they are part of like a lot of different communities. And so they are aware that it would be disingenuous of them to not include that in their work. It would be like almost unnatural for them to not do that. That's why I love them too. That's why we harp on about them all the time on this podcast, is because they are doing the work. They are making really interesting films that are also ethical in the sense that they are considerate and thoughtful and nuanced. I would go so far as to say, a hot take, if your film or your like gay character or whatever you're doing, if it is not nuanced, then it's an unethical portrayal.
I guess this goes back to what we always say, in that if you want good LGBT content, look at LGBT filmmakers, because usually, most of the time, they do take these things into consideration. There have been too many films, I guess, throughout the entire history of cinema, but especially in the last few years, that have gained like a lot of traction. They're made by straight cisgendered people. You know, we have talked about a few of them, and they have like a sick fascination with our misery, I think. We did especially discuss them in the biopic episodes, the most notable examples of those. But yeah, there are heaps more. Even the stories that are nuanced, I think the mainstream does have a weird attachment to the ones that are especially sad, and the fact that there is like kind of an ignorance of any positive storytelling that we have.
The Favourite was a very widely celebrated film during last year's awards season. It's a great film, but it's also absolutely miserable. And I found it interesting the way the mainstream loved it so much and seemed to revel in that misery. Also, the fact that like throughout the whole Oscar campaign, everyone seemed to be like bending over backwards to avoid actually addressing the fact that it is specifically a lesbian film. And like no one would really mention just how devastating it was, and the way the film portrays that aspect of lesbian identity is actually so brutal, and yet they would kind of revel in the absurdity and the cruelty of it all, like, and just ignore the devastation of it.
And it was also very much like, even the way the stars of the film talked about it was very much from the perspective of, oh, this is about women. This is about women suffering and women, as if it was tied more to their identity as women, as their identity as lesbians. It was very, very strange to me, because I was like, yes, this is a story about female oppression, but it's about a very specific kind of female oppression. And it was very strange to me that even Rachel Weisz, who, you know, she was going through her phase of like, I want to be a lesbian in films now. Even she would sort of talk about it in these general terms of it being about women's oppression, sort of white feminist lens of, oh, well, it's about women being oppressed, and sort of erase the queer aspect of the film, which is actually the heart of the film. And I feel like they knew they had to do that, because if they marketed it as a lesbian film, it would have never really got off the ground, I think.
Honestly, hearing The Favourite being described as a film about quote-unquote women's oppression is really funny, because I don't think it's about that at all. I think it's very much just about personal cruelty and personal cruelty inflicted on others. And these people were not oppressed. They were rich monarchs. Queen Anne had the biggest investment in the slave trade at the time. Like, she wasn't oppressed, not really. Like, it was kind of just on a very micro level and in a very personal, queer way. The way that they did market and talk about the film was obviously in a more general, universalized sense. And by universalizing the identity of the film, they've actually erased the queer identity in the film. I guess capitalism kind of teaches us that, oh no, it's better to be more universal. It's better, you know, if more people can relate to it, because obviously we can make more money off it. But the good, in terms of art, the good shit is when it gets specific. And the film itself, I do like that it does get specific, but just the way that it's spoken about and the way that we talk about so many other films and the general way that we do it is so reductive.
Yes. I do think that also comes from this idea there's like a modern day aversion to sad content. You see it online all the time. You see gays in fandom and in online spaces being like, oh, don't see this movie because it's sad. Don't see this movie because it hasn't got a quote unquote happy ending. And I think the standard they're measuring a happy ending against is measuring it against a more like heteronormative scale. They look at a movie, and if it doesn't have the happy ending that iconic film A leap year has, then it's not a happy film. Well, I'm sorry to all you gays out there, but not every film can be leap year. and to compare film about a completely different paradigm of existence and say like, well, up to in the standard, if I'm measuring against this standard, then it's not a happy film. Like, of course it's not going to be, but it's about a completely different experience. So I find that very interesting for myself. I find it very interesting that a lot of gays now will not see something if it's not a quote unquote happy film, which I totally understand. And I know we live in like really stressful times. And if you just want to watch things for escapism, that's fine. But it's sort of descended into this idea that if something is portraying people as sad, then it's bad. And I don't agree with that.
This modern day aversion to sad content, to sad gay films, like it does come from like repeatedly traumatized, and like it's hardened our heart to these kinds of stories. So it's understandable that you'd want to avoid it, because you see mainstream LGBT stories are often going to be like extremely sad for like all parts of the community with the gays, but almost always, especially with trans stories, they're almost always sad in film. There are very few that aren't, which is terrible, obviously. So, you know, of course we're going to develop this aversion to sad endings from the mainstream, but I think the way that it leads people to kind of write off not so happy stories made by actually LGBT creators in the indie film movement, like that really saddens me. Because like, for instance, I remember when Cam Post, The Miseducation of Cameron Post came out, and I think that's a beautiful film. I think it's very important that everyone sees it. It's not a cakewalk, but it's a beautiful, very nuanced film that I think everyone should watch, basically. But I remember people were very against watching it. People were like, no, this has a sad ending, therefore it's like, people were kind of like devaluing it for showing a sad experience, which I don't think is good. I don't think is healthy. I think back to what I said about like therapeutic, making art therapeutically, like I think it is important that we are able to process our pain through art. And I think that's really good. And obviously, you know, just take responsibility of it. I think we've fallen into the danger of devaluing art that does do that, because I think it is very important, especially when you're isolated from your community. For instance, like if you are quite young and just, you know, realizing who you are and not having a sense of community and not having any sense of support, you are going to turn to movies. And I think it is really important to have art that you can turn to that can articulate what you are feeling in a genuine, responsible way. And I think just because it is sad and just because it's not escapism, I don't think we should be writing it off for that reason. So that's just something that I have seen, especially in the last few years. Of course, happy endings are great. I love heaps of stories actually that are sad representations of queer loneliness, especially. Like I love so many stories like that because it's something that I can deeply relate to. And I think of those movies like Happy Together or The Hours or Camp Post or like even A Single Man, Sisterhood, Moonlight even. If I didn't have those, I don't know what I would do with myself, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. Just going back briefly, I do think with gays seeking out happy content only, if you are going to apply like a certain level of criticism, like this level of criticism to films that are sad, you should also apply it to films that are happy. Just because a film is happy or has a quote unquote happy ending, that doesn't mean it's a good film. It does not mean that it's done its job of representing you well, of representing you in an ethical way. I don't want to harp on about this for too long because I've spoken about it before, but I think Love, Simon is like a really irritating film because it is so sanitized and it is so clinical and it is classified as a happy film, but I honestly I don't find it a valuable film because I can't relate to a single element of it. It's so generalized and so sanitized that I can't derive any happiness from it because I really can't relate to it. If you want to be wary about sad content, you should also be wary about happy content. Also, with this binary of happy, sad, I've been thinking about this episode a lot. And one of my major things I have with this episode is I don't like the word sadness. And I like how you said loneliness because I just think sadness is too simple a word and it really oversimplifies the really complex range of emotions and diverse emotions felt by queer people depending on their context, depending on gender, depending on their race, their ethnicity, their religion. Like I think sadness is just too, I don't know, I don't want to say dumb word, but that's the thing that I think queer non-happiness is so much more complex. And, you know, my favorite film tend to be films about people having like a nice time for however short of time, and then it sort of ends. And a lot of people find that to be sad. but I don't think it is, because I sort of see if you can find time and if you can find community, even if it's only for a brief time, that's happy. I also love films that more are about struggling to connect to the people around you because you are queer. Maybe because I relate to that on a personal level that I am yet to be able to realize. But one of my favorite queer films, I don't know if you would classify it as a queer film because it does deal with a lot of other stuff too, is In Between. It's a Palestinian film, and the three main characters, one of them is like non-religious, another one is an Orthodox Christian who's a lesbian, and the other character is a Muslim who is, she's not getting an arranged marriage, but she's like about to marry this dude that she's known for like a long time, and her family have wanted her to marry for a long time. But in the film, the lesbian character, you know, while she is with her friends, she's like very happy
To be a certain way, but when she has to go home, she has to act a different way.
It doesn't suddenly make the life that she has where she's happy, like it doesn't suddenly make that sad, but it just more like adds a depth. I don't like being like films like that being reduced to sad films, because I don't think it's sad. I think there is an element of this is realistic. I don't want to throw that word around because I think it's often weaponized against queer people when we do complain about a certain form of representation, but there are some genuinely beautiful, realistic films that have been made, particularly in recent years, about very specific communities and very specific kinds of people in very specific situations. And I see them as like very happy films that have a very real undertone to them. And that's films that I really love, like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Disobedience. Disobedience is one of my absolute favorite films in the world. I think Disobedience is really beautiful, and I don't think it gets the right kind of appreciation for what it actually did. And Rafiki as well is a really lovely film. And none of those films have what people would typically perceive as happy endings, but they're complex, they're nuanced, and I love them. Even if they're supposedly seen as sad, I still love them. It's so disingenuous to pretend that this sadness doesn't exist, to pretend that these feelings and these experiences don't exist. No offense to all y'all out there who just want to escapist or anything, like I totally understand that, but in my experience, pretending that a trauma does not exist, ignoring that a certain history doesn't exist, doesn't make it or the feelings that it gives you go away. It makes them worse. It makes you feel worse. When I watch a movie when it's like, oh, you should just be happy, you know, blah, blah, like, but I'm not happy for these reasons, and I don't appreciate being told that I should completely disregard the reasons that I may be unhappy or discontented. It can dangerously play into forgetting our own history. And I'm going to be a bit controversial here, and I am going to put forward the idea that I think that is why people want to put forward new terms for the sexualities that already exist. People want to put forward these new words, and it's precisely because they don't want to acknowledge the history attached to certain labels and certain words. And rather than wanting to learn their history, rather than having to acknowledge the history, they go, I'll just make up a new word for myself instead. This is very much connected. That might be a controversial take, but that's what I think.
The kind of like this idea of being post-gender or post-sexuality is, I don't think it's very good.
It's not a binary between happy, sad. It's a scale of how meaningful the representation is
in a text. I think it's weird that, especially with historical films, especially those that deal with LGBT activism, I think it's unfair that they kind of face that scrutiny of being on the sad end of the spectrum, because I think it is very important. History is very important, and it's something that we need to be especially responsible with in portraying, like for instance, films like 120 Beats Per Minute or Pride, or I saw a really great documentary recently called Are You Proud, which is like about the history of Pride festivals in the UK. It's not the concern of whether those films should be sad or should make you feel good or should represent or sadness or happiness or loneliness or whatever in a certain way. It's more about how real they are to us. Not so much realism, not so much about being realistic, but about how genuine they are. I guess like the danger of a lot of, you know, quote unquote happy content that's being made, especially by non-LGBT people, is they kind of erase the very real life problems that we still face today, the very real effects of homophobia and transphobia, and how it has shaped us and how it affects everything that we do, and it pretends that these things don't exist, or pretends that the sources of these things aren't from heteronormative societies or from heterosexual people. Quite a few of them will even try to pin homophobia on queer people themselves, or try to pin transphobia on trans people themselves. It's awful. It's like a kind of erasure and propaganda, and it's just extremely disrespectful to do things like this. So that's the danger of happy content. I think that's the danger of, trying to create, oh yeah, this is just a realistic story. This is set in modern times. Like, no one cares about these things anymore. No one cares or not if you're gay or not anymore. Oh, they're just like you. I'm just gay, as Simon says in Love, Simon. Dude, the only aspect of your identity that I can relate with about you is that you are gay. Stories like that, they're not made for gay people specifically. Like, they're kind of just made for the mainstream. They're made to be universal. They're made so that the people watching them, the straight people or the cisgender people watching them, don't feel bad, that they don't feel accountable for the systems that they put in place to make us unhappy, to say the least. It is kind of a form of propaganda to try to say that these issues don't still affect us, that these issues are absent from our lives now, because they very much aren't. And it's kind of sad to say, but like, I use the inclusion of these issues as a signal to say that these texts actually are for us, because they don't erase what we do go through. Like texts like Dolan's Desiree's or Gregoraki's even, the fact that they do bother to include that homophobia, it signals to me that yes, this is made for me, and not kind of just turning gay people into a spectacle to entertain straight people without making them question at all what they've done to our lives.
It's kind of like, that idea of like, it's kind of like a hashtag. It's kind of like this empty gesture. Like, these happy movies really feel to me like an empty gesture of like, we just want to take the bits that are the most profitable to you and sell them. But the way like often body positive movements, like especially commercial ones, won't talk about patriarchy. They won't talk about ableism. They won't talk about colorism. They won't talk about all these structures that actually very much affect what bodies are perceived as beautiful, what bodies are perceived as positive. Instead, they'll just be like, hashtag love yourself. That's what happy content often is for gay media. It's literally like, we don't want to acknowledge any of this structural stuff. We just want you to be like, woohoo, I want Simon and Blue to kiss, because that is what a rom-com wants. But I don't have to think about the fact that this movie just outed Simon and how that is a bad thing or anything like that. I just feel like it's very hollow. To that thing where you said you feel like when LGBT filmmakers include homophobia and that's how you know it's for you, I feel like that doesn't always apply, because we see homophobia utilized in a lot of different ways by straight filmmakers to make a character more interesting, but not necessarily to be gay. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And I don't apply that to all texts. Again, there's just nuance everywhere, and it depends in each case. But especially in happy films that aren't necessarily about homophobia, that are about different things. For example, Now Apocalypse, they do incorporate homophobia. They do show how that still affects their lives in a way that doesn't necessarily make the whole story about homophobia, but it does kind of signal to me that, they're not erasing that aspect of our experience.
I have a question for you, Dee. Do you think media has a responsibility to include homophobia? Do you think that it is the responsibility of media to educate? If I'm an LGBT filmmaker and I'm making a film, is it my responsibility to educate, even though I may not be making the film for that intention, for the intention of educating a non-LGBT audience? Do you think I still have to consider that responsibility? Is that the responsibility of queer media?
No, I don't think that's the responsibility. I don't mean, oh, you have to include homophobia in your generally happy story in order for me to think that you care about me or care about your gay audience or whatever. It's not that you have to. It's just that lately, these days, it's the only thing that's signaled to me that there's a genuine wish to represent my experiences in a text, which is really sad. I don't think it's necessary all the time, but it's just something that is the most easily identifiable.
It's not even so much for the sake of accurately representing my experiences. It's more so that I don't feel like you're trying to simply appease straight audiences and keep them comfortable and help them continue